The views and opinions of guests on this show are not a reflection of the views of the management or staff of this channel. The production of this show is made possible by the support of viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and become a subscriber. Welcome to Conversations That Matter. Each week we address an issue that is shaping the future of British Columbia. Today joining me is McNish. Mike, democracy. Where are we at in this country when it comes to engagement in the democratic process?
Well, Stu, let's start with the last federal election, 2011. Barely half of those eligible to vote in Canada exercised their franchise, 54%. That's the second lowest turnout level in Canadian election history. Where do you think we rate in terms of other developed countries?
Bottom half?
A C. We get a C when it comes to voter turnout. We're doing a little bit better than the United States. They're at about 38% voter turnout in federal elections. So we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back. It's a big issue, and Mario Canseco is going to be speaking with us today. He's been a pollster for over 10 years, worked for Angus Reid, and now with Insights West. It's interesting when you look at elections, oftentimes people say, it's the young people, they're just not turning out. And in fact, they're right. The 18 to 24-year-olds in the 2011 federal election here, not even 40% of them bothered to vote. But Mario says, let's take a different perspective. It's not just the youth, it's more complicated than that. The future elections, provincial, federal elections that we're looking at in the years to come, they're going to be decided by what he calls non-voters. So these are the people that just don't turn out. But they do turn out when there's a galvanizing issue, something like a scandal. Think back to the 2006 federal election and the sponsorship scandal. So Mario Canseco has a lot to say, obviously, about the sad state of affairs of our current election situation, but has some great ideas as well about how can governments work in the future to make sure that more Canadians have a say in the future.
So many of those big issues over the last 10 years are about scandal or getting rid of somebody rather than embracing a bold new idea. Are we out of new ideas? Is that part of the equation, or is it voter education? Is it voter apathy? It's a very difficult, very complex issue to try and address, understand, and then turn the trend around.
No doubt. And Stu, a lot of people will say we're missing an opportunity in terms of not capitalizing on the internet and how the internet can help get more people to vote. When people were asked, those that didn't vote, why didn't you vote? Well over 55% of them said, well, I was busy. I had to get the kids to school, I had a work commitment, and we were on holidays. The same people said if they had the opportunity to vote online, over half those people that didn't vote said, absolutely, I'll vote online. So are we missing an opportunity? Is it maybe not so much about the issues and the scandals, but maybe we're not leveraging all the tools and technology that we have at our disposal to really open up the electoral process?
Mario gets into that and so many other aspects of what's happening with democracy here in British Columbia in the conversation that I recorded with him on August the 25th. We'll be back in a moment with that conversation. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I'm glad that you're here because I find it perplexing. We live in one of the most liberal democracies in the world, and yet the people who call this country home, and in particular our province here, British Columbia, in increasing numbers aren't bothering to take up their democratic right, and that is to go vote, and also to get involved in politics, especially at the local level. What's going on?
Well, what I've seen in the research that I've conducted on this matter is there's more attention paid to the federal level of politics. To a lesser extent to what happens in BC, but municipal politics, which really affect us the most of our taxes go there. people do not pay attention to them as much as they would. They can be really happy about something that Harper said, or very unhappy with him because of some decision that he made, but they aren't really that close to their municipal politicians, and that's been one of the major difficulties as well. They're not paying attention to it.
Is that because when we look at what's happening on the federal level, there's more money that gets thrown at it, the media covers it more in depth, there's a lot more ads, there's this sense of it's more important?
Well, BC has a difficulty which we do not have in Toronto. The city has effectively amalgamated. So you can have a very big story about Toronto that is going to be seen by a lot of people who maybe 30, 40 years ago were living in a very different area that was not actually Toronto. And here you may have a story that is Vancouver based, and you go, well, there might be a lot of people outside of the city who may not understand this, who don't care about bike lanes, who don't know who the mayor is. Maybe we shouldn't devote 5 or 6 minutes to this story because it's not BC wide.
So does it come down to geography that way? Or does it come down to the ability of journalistic outlets to be able to cover that? Or does it just come down to information overload on behalf of the average person who's going, well, I got to pick up my kids from daycare and I got to pay the bills?
Well, there's a couple of issues there, and one of them, which is really key for me, is the fact that with the voter turnout becoming lower and lower, it's ultimately about having something that a lot of people can get behind. And we haven't seen that recently. Surrey had a very dismal turnout the last time around. And one of the reasons for it was that everybody thought that Diane Watts was going to win in a landslide. A lot of people maybe had something different they wanted to do on a rainy Saturday morning. Why go vote? Maybe I'm happy and I know that this isn't going to change. But Vancouver, which had a much more competitive race, also had a very low voter turnout. Essentially we had 2 out of 5 people who were registered to vote in the city who came out and voted, which is very low.
2 out of 5.
Slightly less than that. I think it was 37.5%. So even less than that, which is dismal. If you look at the federal elections, the one election over the past 100 years where we had the best voter turnout was 1988. And it was an election that had the big idea behind it. It was essentially a choice between free trade with the United States or not. It wasn't necessarily progressive conservative versus NDP versus liberal. It was free trade or no free trade. When you have an issue like that, people show up and actually vote. If you don't have an issue that is going to make somebody who may not actually pay a lot of attention to what is going on around them, then they're not going to show up and vote.
Well, that 1988 election actually became a referendum. It wasn't just you're the prime minister, but this is a referendum on free trade.
And it would have been interesting if the referendum on transportation had happened at the same time as the municipal election this year, because maybe that would have boosted turnout. We're still, it's really early to know what is going to happen now, but I guess there's only one way to go, and that is up, hopefully.
But at the same time as we see voter turnout dropping, we also see civic engagement at all levels. There's development going on in my neighborhood. There's a new transportation line that's going through. And people go, oh, when did this happen? How come I wasn't told? And yet there are avenues to get the information out. It's not being heard. People aren't getting involved.
Well, I think there's several difficulties for that. One of them is the fact that we're busy, we're doing a lot of stuff. We may see something when we come back home that asks us to go to a meeting and to spend 2 hours there on a Saturday night or on a Wednesday evening. It might be too difficult for the average person to be there. Maybe you have something to say. There might be some electronic forums as well, but looking at the numbers that the city gets on this, it's not something that they have done very well. They are really doing well on some other areas, such as sanitation, but they're not really doing well in one thing that they wanted to do when they got elected, which was essentially connecting with voters. And even those who don't like you, we want to know what you think about what is going on in your city. And there's a lot of people out there who aren't happy with the job they're doing.
There is this perception, though, and you can talk to people in almost any sector of society that say, what's the point? City Hall's not going to listen to me. They've already made up their mind. What I have to say doesn't matter. Are they right in that perception?
Well, it's ultimately about things that you saw happening. And I think one of the best examples is the first bike lane. Before it was voted on council, they already had the equipment ready to build it. It was sitting there just waiting for the green light from council. And we could argue that they had a majority in the council and that it was something that was going to be rubber stamped. But it sends the wrong message when you haven't even voted on it and you're already ready to build it. So ultimately, I think it really has to do with how you talk to people who may not be happy. It's very easy to find a forum in this city if you like the bike lanes, if you ride a bike, if you're happy with the way things are going, if you're all about certain issues that might be something that is likable for the Vision Vancouver voter. If you're not one of them, it might be tough for you to have your say.
Well, for many it seems almost impossible. So we wind up with camps of people who are the, for lack of a better term, the rent-a-crowd. They show up and protest almost anything. And I don't know that they're getting listened to by anyone. And yet they're an extension of what was a political movement in the 1960s that really did have impact. And so if that, like, I'm going to take to the streets and let the elected officials know I'm not happy about this, but that doesn't seem to be working, what other venues do we have available to us?
Well, one of the reasons why it doesn't work as well as it did in the past is that you may not be representing everybody. This is what makes my job so wonderful and so compelling. I get the chance to ask a representative sample how they feel about things. And I get all those emails from those on both sides of the issue. Everybody in my family is happy with the mayor. Congratulations, you live in a family where you can all get together and not fight over politics. It certainly wasn't the case in my family. Or the other side, how can you say that Harper is really popular when we see that there's a lot of people, there's nobody I know who likes him? Well, this is the way Canada works. This is the way that the city works. There may be a lot of people who do not think the way you do, and if you're getting together in the same place, that doesn't make you representatives of the entire city or the entire country.
So how do we get beyond that? How do we get a better collective voice without having to say, okay, well, I'm now going to dedicate myself to working within that political party? I still want my views to be represented and considered when making a decision that hopefully will take into the best interests of all of us.
Well, voting certainly is the first step, and that is the one step that we're forgetting many times. People may not be happy with the candidates that they have. There's a lot of disappointment with the system, particularly people who vote for a party that is not electing anybody. Green Party, for instance, they only have one MLA in Victoria, one MP in Ottawa, and that's it. And there's a lot of people who say, I live in an area and I want to vote Green, but if I vote Green, then I'm not going to win the election. Well, it's not always about winning. It's about registering what you think should be happening, and you have your own representative to do so. But one of the difficulties there is people, especially young people, tend to become involved in the whole political aspect of life when they're 19 or 20, 21 maybe, and they're starting to pay attention. They will vote for the first time from 18 to 22, and they become disenchanted with the idea that they've lost. But I was told that this was about democracy. I voted, and the candidate I voted and the party I voted for did not form the government. Well, that's the way the game is played. It's not always going to go your way. And there's a lot of people who expect that if they're going to vote for somebody, they have to win.
So do we have to take a step back right into the school system and say there has to be a better teaching of how the system works, and recognize that you have the opportunity to put your voice forward, but it doesn't mean that it's going to carry the majority?
Well, I would argue that it should also start in the home. There's a lot of people who I've met over the course of my time in Canada who aren't really that interested in the whole political aspect, and it's something that wasn't really nurtured by their parents. There's a lot of pride on certain aspects of the country, for instance, the healthcare system, the fact that we're great at hockey. To a lesser extent, there's a lot of good feelings to the monarchy in some areas. But when you ask them how the country works, it's difficult. I took the citizenship test, and I did well. I'm a citizen now, and I'm very happy about it. But I was showing the citizenship test to a lot of people in my office back in 2007, and they weren't able to answer the first 7 questions, which is terrifying. They were born in this country,
raised here,
and they don't know how it operates. They couldn't figure out who the head of state was. They couldn't figure out how the prime minister got elected. And you start to wonder, you're not talking about this at home, so when the election rolls around, you're going to have other things to do instead of voting.
There's a considerable amount of evidence, I understand, that suggests that if you don't live in a family that engages in the political discussion and strives to understand how it works, the likelihood of you voting starts to diminish rapidly. Then add in level of education, and it drops off even more. So is this how we wind up having a group of elites who, in essence, pick who's going to run the country.
Well, there's an example on how you can counter that. And it's my favorite example from a 2008 election in the United States. The state of Indiana. It had not been carried by a Democratic candidate since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And Obama's campaign knocked on every door. They went to the universities. They went to Notre Dame. They went to Indiana University and talked to the young people. You may not have voted in your life, but this one is important. Here's a candidate who's different. Here's a candidate who's going to give you the healthcare system that you want. They ended up winning Indiana the first time, 2008. They didn't win 4 years later. But that election was astonishing for everybody who likes politics. Here's an area that hasn't voted Democratic in decades. And they won on the basis of young people who came out and decided to support Obama.
But the way you explain that, it seems that it was the team that was behind Obama helped to make that happen.
But it's also because you have this big idea behind you. You can knock on as many doors as you want, but if there's nothing that is going to be compelling enough for me to go there and vote for you, it's not going to be enough.
So does that say something about where we're at as a society? Do we think, well, there aren't any big ideas left any longer, that things are working quite well? Most people are employed. There's pretty good education. Healthcare kind of works. So the system works. What do I have to worry about?
Well, it is one of the situations that has led to so few changes in government over the past few years. You know, Quebec has a mind of its own, and they like to go back and forth between separatists and liberals. But there are other areas where it's been very difficult for any political party to break through. Ontario was a great example, for instance. They started out in a situation where they thought they didn't want to stay with the Liberals. They didn't like what they saw during that campaign, and they ended up staying with them, giving them a majority mandate. So, you know, one of the difficulties is that you can ask people on how they will vote if they're happy with the way things are going. They want the change, but if it doesn't materialize with everybody else, then it's not going to work.
So does voter turnout go up when there's dissatisfaction with the sitting government and down when there is complacency?
Yes, long lineups usually mean that the government is in trouble, or the incumbent MLA in the area, for instance. That suggests that there's people out there who may not be happy with the way things are going. Surrey is a great example 3 years ago. Less than 30% of voters actually bothered to cast a ballot. It was a massive victory for Diane Watts, but when you factor in the actual percentage of registered voters who supported her, it's a minority. It looks fantastic when you say, I got 80% of the vote. Yes, but you only had 20-something percent of the voters who actually bothered to show up at the polling station.
So have we also reached a point where politics have become very entrenched? This is a blue state, that's a red state, Diane Watts is going to win here, Christy Clark is going to win there, Stephen Harper here, Adrian Dix there. And so if you're in those jurisdictions, you say, what does my vote matter anyways?
Well, it makes it a lot tougher, of course. Vancouver Island is a good example. I mean, there's one green, and all of the rest of it is NDP. So it's a difficult area. That's where the capital is. And the Liberals do not have any seats there, which is kind of bizarre. But ultimately, it's about using those resources where you need to. Again, going back to the 2008 election, they thought Indiana was winnable. Wyoming, not so much. Let's not knock on a lot of doors on a place where we're not going to get those votes that we need.
And so political parties are now starting to be very strategic in the way that they position their dollars and their efforts to say, this is where we can win, we're not even going to bother over here. How then do they wind up with a mandate that says, because at the end of it all, it's the winner takes all, yes, and you're the winner of everybody. How does the group that doesn't win get representation then, especially if there is low voter turnout in those areas, because people say, what difference does it make? Well,
and it certainly raises questions about your ability as an opposition to get people to topple the government, so to speak. And there are certain examples where it has worked very well. The election of 2001, for instance, the first election for the BC Liberals, that was a massive mandate, and it wasn't something that was based necessarily on the NDP voters staying home. It was based more than anything on people being mad at what was happening at the time.
And they were throwing out the sitting government.
Exactly. It wasn't a question of, and I would argue that the 2006 election was similar to that. There was never this embrace of Harper or of the federal Conservatives or the values that they represented. It was more a question of we're really unhappy with the way the Liberals have been running the show. We're not happy with the sponsorship scandal. They hammered that a point across until people decided to vote Conservative.
Mm-hmm. Mob mentality becomes a part of the equation as well, doesn't it? How do we get around that? Like, there's so many challenges around increasing voter turnout, and mob mentality being one of them. You're the group that seems to be in control, and well, I'm not going to stick my head above the ground for fear you're going to cut it off.
Well, and it's something that can happen in many instances. You know, we just came off an election where it was very difficult to figure out who was going to win because of a lot of people changing their minds and a lot of people who weren't actually saying what they were planning on doing. And this is something that can happen in many other places. One of the difficulties there is you may not want to say something because it's an unpopular opinion. And I mean, I don't want to go back to Nixon and the silent majority because it wasn't silent, neither a majority necessarily, but it's that concept of somebody who's not actually being particularly open about what they like or dislike. They may have very strong feelings about specific municipal politicians, but they may not be talking about it, or strong feelings about things that are really close to them, which is ultimately what happens when you're talking about municipal politics. You may live in a place where 2 blocks you had a store and now it's a building, and now you have to drive somewhere else if you want to get something, or you have to cycle somewhere else if you want to get something. So those are the things that are making people uneasy. It's not necessarily about the big picture. It's about how is this affecting my own neighborhood where I chose to live, and now some of the reasons that I chose for being here have been taken away from me.
But still, here I am. This is my community. This is the place that matters to me the most because that's where my house is. I own that piece of land. I have title. I pay taxes on it. It means a lot to me. And still, I'm not going down and holding the government that is the most responsive, or supposed to be the most responsive to me, accountable. And so then they can go ahead and do almost whatever they want. Until maybe they push it too far, but that may be 15 years down the road and we're into an irreversible trend. How do we turn that around, and what role do you play in helping to ensure that we don't get too far off track?
Well, what is important there is it's very difficult for a government to be thrown out of office, or for a lot of people to vote necessarily against them unless something goes horribly wrong. My example would be Sam Sullivan. He was very popular, very well liked, somebody who was a great example. He went to Turin to get the flag. He was an international figure. The garbage strike ultimately destroyed his municipal career. People were so unhappy with the fact that they did not get any garbage picked up for weeks. And that leads to his own party saying, we don't want you to run in the next election. So ultimately, some of those mistakes come back to haunt you. Now, on the question of engagement, I think it's ultimately not something that can be done by technology alone. You can have the best platform for a lot of people to connect and to talk, but if the city is the one who's handling the questions, if the city is the one who's handling what they want to say to you, what they will share with you, it's ultimately something that is not going to be yours. And so there are certainly better ways to do it. It's better than the types of meetings that we used to have 5 or 6 years ago, where you had 100 people in a room, everybody grabbed a microphone, and you never knew who somebody else was going to say. Those exercises were futile. But ultimately, what you need is somebody from the outside who can tell you this is what the community has been saying. It's more of a research exercise than a technology exercise, and I think that's why the efforts of the city have been misguided.
So where do you come into the mix here? In the work that you do, how do you help to ensure that the democratic process gets carried out in a way that is truly representative?
Well, one of the things that we like to do is to ask questions about things that could be interesting for anybody, not necessarily the media. I mean, the media likes it when we do something and we get the phone calls and we talk, but it's also about playing a role in the conversation about how the city should be run, how the province should be run, which policies should the country undertake. And one of those issues necessarily has to be, how do you want to actually participate? I've asked many times, should voting be mandatory? And you get more than 70% of Canadians saying, yes, voting should be mandatory.
More than 70% say it should be mandatory, but only 30% show up for municipal elections.
Exactly.
There's a disconnect there.
Which is difficult, right? I mean, you look at it and you go, well, if you were to have mandatory voting like they do in Greece or in Australia, you're subject to a fine if you don't vote. Mm-hmm. And you know, there's a lot of people who say, if we make voting mandatory, then there's going to be all of these crazy parties. It's not necessarily the case. You know, it's ultimately about making sure that you're involved in the actual process. Mind you, this is something that has to happen federally. Mm-hmm. But you know, there's a lot of people who say, force me to do it. Mm-hmm. I may not have voted in the last election because I was unhappy or I had other commitments. And it's nice that the city is now allowing us to vote 6 or 7 days before the election, making it easier for those of us who want to vote to actually do so. But ultimately, it really needs to be something where you force people to do it. You know, when you have 70% of Canadians saying, I'm all for mandatory voting, then what they're doing is push me a little bit. You know, if you make it mandatory, I might actually show up and vote.
But isn't part of democracy that we take individual responsibility? And this would be the counter argument to making it mandatory. I have a responsibility to myself and to the place I call home. And so therefore, I need to assume that responsibility. Don't tell me that I have to do it, because you know that's what my mother did when I was growing up, and her job was to teach me independence. And do we not want to be independent of the state, especially where we call ourselves a democracy?
Well, there are other democracies that do it. You know, I don't think it necessarily takes away from it. You know, there's been elections in my life. I voted in 2 different countries where you are really disappointed with the choices. It's still better to show up and to cross off your ballot or to write they all are terrible, yeah, or to destroy it if it's legal, or to eat it, which you can do in Canada. It's a violation of the Electoral Act.
You cannot eat it.
You cannot eat it. Yeah. But do something with your ballot. Show up and register that dismay at the status quo and at the way things are going. Don't just sit at home, because if you sit at home, then you're not really registering any dismay at the system.
Do you believe that people who don't vote actually have a right to complain when the government isn't the one that they wanted?
Well, it isn't the one that they wanted because they didn't show up. So that is one of the arguments. But ultimately, we live in an area where you can have certain freedoms. There are many places in the world that are certainly not as lucky as we are in Canada. Mm. And I look at it more as a sense of responsibility. This is what you need to do. This is part of your own values. I brought those values from Mexico, which is a place which not every election was particularly fair and free, but I had those values instilled in me from my father, from my mother, from my brothers, from my sister. They were the ones who were talking about these things when I was 7 or 8 years old, and it stuck with me. It's important to be part of the process.
Clearly in your career, because you were a journalist before, and one of the roles of a journalist is to hold politicians accountable. But you left that work in the changing media landscape. What are you doing now to help keep politicians accountable?
Well, what I like to do is look at specific issues that are important for the debate. And there's been a lot of talk about where we're heading as a British Columbia. Where is fracking going to take us? Is LNG going to pay for everything that we require? Are we saying yes or no to the Northern Gateway pipeline? How do we feel about Kinder Morgan? I mean, those are all tankers. Very important questions. And most of the research that gets done on those things is done for the benefit of the companies that run those particular projects, or for the governments that are going to make a decision on it. What we like to do is give you the voice. How do you feel about this thing? Should this be approved? Should this be happening? And it's an important way to maintain those stories out there. It's a representative sample. I'm not trying to be friends with any government or with any company. I'm just telling you what you told us. When you reach out there to find out what individual British Columbians think about these major issues, where are they going to get the information, and how well informed are they? That's a very good question. It's important for us to look at the mindscape, at the landscape of BC, and to figure out how they're feeling about specific things, particularly when it comes to where they get their information. And it's also one thing that is important is, did you vote in the last election? Who did you vote for in the last election? Are you really engaged in the way things are happening? Are you understanding specific policies? And that is what leads to some interesting differences. When you're looking at those tables, you may not be surprised to know that there's a majority of residents who are disappointed with the government on how it's handling education. But you will be surprised to see that there's 30 or 40% of busy liberal voters who say this is not what we voted for. And that is important for me. Looking at those pockets, we're not nearly a perfect society. And there's a lot of people who simply behave like we can do whatever we want. And it happens in all levels, not just BC-wide.
People say they voted for something, but did they really know what they were voting for at the time? Are you finding that the electorate is properly informed about the issues? Or are we becoming such a sloganistic, headline, PR, promoting kind of society that people only catch the thinnest amount of information and don't really understand what it is that they're voting for?
Well, there is that component for sure. I mean, usually you have about 25 to 30% of people in any given election who will make up their minds on the last week. And that means that you didn't pay attention to several things that were happening. And you know, there may be something that was negative for the government at some point, which you probably didn't even hear about because maybe the media thought it was overkill to keep talking about it consistently. You start actually paying attention to the campaign on the last week of the campaign, and you may like how one of the candidates looks or certain things that they're saying about a specific policy. But we don't usually vote giving them a blank check for everything. There may be people who voted for a party based on the economy, but are dismayed at their environmental record, and that's okay because we do not have another choice you could pick.
So I sit here and I think that each one of us has a responsibility to vote, and I want people to be informed. I want them to follow through with that process. But I have had discussions with people that say, if those people don't feel like they're properly informed and choose not to vote, good for them. Maybe they should. Maybe they're doing the right thing.
Well, maybe, but ultimately, wouldn't you rather have a more informed public? Somebody who makes a decision. If your decision is to stay home, make that an informed decision. If your decision is to show up and to cast a ballot for none of the above, which is allowed in some countries, then do so. But it's more important to register that than to simply forego your right, the right that a lot of people fought very hard to get, particularly for women.
Well, I do know people who will say, I don't like any of the choices that are presented to me. I'm going to make a protest vote. And are we seeing a growing trend there? And if so, then do we need to then start to re-examine the way that we, register votes and elect people? Because we tried to do that. we did try to do it, and it was rejected.
Well, what I think was missing from the Citizens Assembly that looked into single transferable vote, the system was just too complicated. And it really made a lot of people who don't pay attention to politics more wary of the process. Well, gee, so I'm not voting for my MLA anymore. I'm giving him the number 1, the number 2, the number 3. There was an exercise. Britain just went through that exercise a few years ago, and it was also defeated. And there was this town hall meeting, and they were talking about ways to explain to the people in the town how they were going to understand this single vote system. So they said, we are going to order pizza. And here's 6 choices for pizza. Number 1 is your first choice, number 2 is your second choice. They went through this whole process. And the winner was the veggie pizza, because the veggie pizza was number 2 for everybody. But nobody had veggie pizza as their number 1. And they were furious, like, this is the way we're going to elect our government? I don't want the veggie pizza, I want my pepperoni, or by Hawaiian, whatever it was. So it was impossible for them to understand how it works, because the first time that they were testing it, they were dissatisfied with the outcome.
They wound up with the veggie pizza and they wanted pepperoni. But when we take a look at what happened here in British Columbia, what I found interesting is the Liberals who were in power, who were leading this initiative, were the ones who embraced it and said, let's do it, even though they stood to lose as a result. It was the NDP who actively campaigned against it, and yet they stood to gain.
Allegedly, I mean, you could argue that really would have been the case, but it's difficult to try to transplant that type of system into a country like ours. There's a rich tradition of electing your own MLA, having somebody who sends you a flyer every couple of weeks about what they're doing, who's actually talking to you about specific things. We cannot turn into a Scandinavian country. It's rare for a minority government there to be toppled. It's very easy for them to get together in a room and for the anti-immigration party to vote on some things that are financial, and for the Green Party to vote against the anti-immigration party, and they make it work, and they have elections every 4 years. We don't have that capacity because of the way politics are done. It's very nice to think, you know, if we had a system where we could elect MLAs based on a proportional a representation, it certainly would be easier, but we're not that system. I don't think people will necessarily like it.
The American system comes closer to that because you have different branches of government. And so you can have a Democrat and Republican both representing the same jurisdiction or riding, whereas we don't have that here. It's an all or nothing.
Well, but the U.S. has another big problem, which is re-electing the House of Representatives every 2 years. It's the shortest term anywhere in the world except for Christmas Island, where they elect their council every December 24th, and they only have 24 people, and one guy is the prime minister and gets to go to the UN. You know, electing everybody every 2 years is crazy. You're spending the first 6 months of your term thinking everybody who got you elected, then 1 year working, and then the next 6 months campaigning. It's just impossible.
So
Great for people who work on campaigns, of course, but not for the average man.
I think it was Winston Churchill who said, you know, democracy is the worst form of government there is, except for the fact that it's better than all the other alternatives. And yet, if we're not participating, how can we call this a democracy?
Well, and that's one of the major issues that we need to deal with as a country, as a city. There may be the idea that everybody's happy. There's so many ways to interpret, and this is why staying home is difficult. Staying home does not mean anything. If you stay at home, it can be interpreted as everybody's mad at the system, this is a message to the mayor, this is a message to the premier. Or the other way around, you know, people stayed at home because they had better things to do and they're happy with the status quo. No, the only way to know is to actually register your vote and to make sure that you're choosing what you think is best for the city or for the province.
You're engaged every day in the work that you do with voters. Do you sense that we've bottomed out, or are we going to continue on a downward trend?
I think this election will be different, and you know, one of the reasons for it municipally is Surrey is going to have a much more competitive race than the last time around. They have 3 very credible candidates, well, 2 who have already registered, 1 that is going to register soon. Very credible candidates who might be able to get voters to become more engaged in the way the city has been run and to get those voters out. Similar case here in Vancouver. You know, Vision Vancouver is a very well-oiled machine. They know exactly which doors to knock on. They are very engaged, particularly with the 18 to 34 demographic, which is allegedly those are the ones who don't vote usually, and they seem to be very happy with the way the mayor has been doing things. So it really can't all be won based on age, because you could argue that the nonpartisan association would be able to get some of the over 55 voters out and to do things differently. But ultimately, it's a game of knocking on doors. But if there's nothing that is going to compel me to go out there and vote, you can knock on my door 17 times a day. I'm not going to bother voting.
Well, it's a little bit of a challenge. If we look at the Vancouver race, we've got Mayor Gregor Robertson, and I know that they have their own issues around transparency, that people look at them and go, well, you're not very transparent. But how does the NPA come along as an alternative when they don't even have an election to pick who their candidate is going to be? So where are we at with transparency, and how important is that to voters?
Well, I think one of the problems with Vision is it's okay for a government to be rated very low on issues such as engagement or the actual way that City Hall works, or any government. We could look at it federally. When you promise that you're going to make things different, that is when people really hold you accountable. And that is one of the realities that they're facing at this point. They may be getting a lot of good numbers on some of the things that they're doing, but on making City Hall work in an unbiased fashion, they're not doing very well. Engaging with the regular citizens, they're not doing very well. And dealing with homelessness, they're not doing very well. Those 3 things were things that they talked about at length in their first campaign and their second campaign. So it's not something that is coming out of nowhere. It's not difficult to say that, you know, maybe we'll see in a federal survey that a lot of Canadians do not think that Harper is engaging with them. That's okay. He never said he was going to be open, transparent, and was going to listen to what is happening. But when you do it, when you campaign on it, and you don't deliver on that promise, it's certainly difficult. And I think this is one of the problems that they're facing.
So you think that Vancouver we might actually see greater turnout in the city of Vancouver. But what about Burnaby? it's a lock, and it's been the same council for the last dozen years.
Well, Burnaby is an interesting case because there may be some discussions about the future of the city, high level of Asian population, which not all of them, mind you, are voters. I know because I'm an example of an immigrant who spent 8 years here wanting to vote, but I couldn't do it until I became a citizen. So not everybody who's out there and is a minority can actually cast a ballot. I think what they have done very well is really zero in on the Kinder Morgan issue. This is affecting them directly. And it's a winnable issue because a lot of people in the city are concerned about Kinder Morgan. So when you campaign on keep us here and we're going to hold Kinder Morgan accountable, it's certainly going to be difficult for whoever wants to run against them.
But what happens in Kamloops and Prince George and Port Alberni, where we're seeing also low voter turnout?
Well, the saddest cases for me are the ones where nobody bothers to run, where you don't even have an election, where the mayor and the council are effectively elected by acclamation because nobody decided to throw their hat into the ring. And that is also problematic. It's not necessarily that everything is fine. It's also that people do not think that there are winnable conditions because of the way the cities are run. And that's also very, very terrifying.
So as you look down the road over the next 10 or 15 years, where do you think we're going in British Columbia as far as voter engagement and civic engagement once we're in between elections?
I think there's a lot to be said about what technology can do for us. There's never been an easier time to complain about something. There's never been an easier time to share something with somebody. And most of the time, we started using social media to share funny pictures, to share the dish that we had for dinner, to share something funny. But we're slowly starting to use social media for ideas. And I think this is, down the road, my hope would be that there's a lot of people who start using social media to engage, to talk about certain things that they like, not necessarily pushing them from one side to the other, because that is the other problem that we have right now on social media. Paid trolls, who you can tell are working on the benefit of a specific political party or candidate, trying to steer conversations their way. But it may become something as easy as email. It'll be part of our lives, it'll be there with us, and you start to use that technology to engage and to make things better. Ultimately, I think it'll be easier also to complain about things that are going wrong with your government and make it more essential to be in touch with the people who elected you. And we're slowly moving there, but I think it's not a mechanism that can be controlled by the cities themselves. It's something that has to come from outside.
And you're still at that stage where you're hoping rather than saying it's a trend.
Yes. Yeah, because it's ultimately dependent on the ideas that are put forward. We may not like the way the city is run or BC is run or Canada is run, but ultimately you need to have an idea behind it to make sure that the change can happen.
It's a very complex set of ingredients that go into determine what voter engagement will be and what voter turnout will be. There's no easy answer, is there?
No, and I think it really depends on three factors. One of them is the value of your idea, something that is going to make it compelling for me to care. Maybe I don't care because I'm happy with the way things are going. You need to tell me why I should care, and that's reason number one. Reason number two.
And that becomes the candidate's responsibility.
Right. It's something that they have to do themselves. Reason number two: the voter needs to get informed. It's not just about somebody who knocked on your door. You need to go to their website. You need to read about what they're doing. You need to learn about what their parties had done in the past. And
Take responsibility.
Absolutely, it's your responsibility. And the third one is, and it really continues to be organizing. I live in what used to be a Christy Clark's riding. Every day we got a phone call from different people, from different political parties, pollsters. Everybody wanted to know how we were feeling about things. And it's interesting that it was happening at that particular time because of the importance of the race.
Right.
I don't know if they're going to be calling that often in the next 100 days before the Vancouver municipal election.
Well, when was the last time they called?
Municipally?
Yeah.
Never.
And that's part of the problem. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We'll be watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.